Hi, my name is Andrew Francis, and I'm going to continue in part 2 about Incarnational Ecclesiology. In other words, understanding the church with reference to the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. Some years ago, when I was visiting India, I was asked to take a Bible study with some young pastors. I decided to go through the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel with them. Despite living in the midst of a shame-based culture in which pregnancy outside of marriage would potentially ruin a young girl's future prospects for marriage and bring shame to her family, it seemed that these young pastors had failed to enter into the difficulties and implications on offer from Matthew in his retelling of the birth of Jesus. The romantic presentations of the Christmas story offered by the West, along with the culturally driven need to present a powerful and successful Jesus in powerful and successful churches, helped ensure that churches full of poor people and people covered in a deep sense of shame might never come to face to face with the Messiah, who not only refused to shame them further, as their well-meaning pastors often did in their sermons, but who in birth took his place under the very shadow of the shame that was their lot. What if the church in India understood itself as reflecting a Messiah whose genealogy included immoral women, whose own mother's morality was the subject of gossip and shaming? What if the church in the West also identified with the Messiah whose early life included being a refugee, forced to flee both the political and religious establishment at the time simply because of who he was? And whilst in the crucifixion, the Jesus we see is equally at odds with the political and religious institutions of the time, whilst fully identifying with the sin, shame, and poverty of fallen humanity. But somehow, due to our preoccupation with the implication of the crucifixion for our eternal salvation, it seems as if we need a reminder that the birth and life of Jesus provides us with. As T.F. Torrance explains, in this way, it is apparent that the Church of Christ was not just the holy society founded to perpetuate his memory or to observe his teachings or to proclaim his gospel, but that it inhered in his being as the incarnate Son, was rooted in his humanity as the historical Jesus, and grew out of the fulfillment of his ministry in the flesh. The Church of the New Covenant arose out of the indivisible union of the Messiah and the people of God he came to redeem and raise up. It grew out of the concrete way in which he lived his divine life within their human existence, thereby transforming their whole way of life. It took shape and form in every act that he performed and derived its essential structure from the way in which he fulfilled his ministry on their behalf. In other words, the life that we are called to live as Christians can and should indeed find precedence in Jesus' life on earth. The ecclesiologies, the understandings we have of church that we form, likewise can and should also find an enfleshed example in the God who himself was enfleshed in Jesus Christ. And so I'll be arguing that the birth narratives found in Matthew chapter 1 and 2 provide a powerful resource for further ecclesiological exploration. In these talks, I will attempt to explain how the infancy narratives of Jesus Christ presented in Matthew chapters 1 and 2 offer correctives to present ecclesiological theory and praxis. And though my own initial exploration of the birth narratives began in a non-Western context, I will be suggesting that an incarnational ecclesiology can also speak to the current crisis experienced by the church in the West. This crisis is evidenced most obviously in the dramatic reduction of people attending church or identifying as Christian. It offers a way forward that will facilitate renewed understandings of how the church can better express the gospel of Christ in a biblically faithful way, whilst engaging more deeply with a world that is increasingly disillusioned with Christianity and the church. In this thesis, or these classes, I will not be attempting to offer a full incarnational ecclesiology. The 2 chapters of Matthew's Gospel can certainly offer some pointers to what an incarnational ecclesiology might look like, but there would need to be an engagement with a much wider selection of passages from all 4 Gospels to fill out further ecclesiological implications than those offered by such a selective reading. My own interaction with the Gospels has forced me to reassess both the nature of ministry as an Anglican priest and the nature of the church itself. I saw in Jesus' life and ministry a humility and vulnerability that seemed to have been obscured behind the trappings of diocesan demands, structures, and church law. Such reading eventually challenged me to leave the denominational setting in which I was working to seek out more incarnational ways of ministering and being church that hopefully reflected something of the vulnerability I saw in Jesus. This reading of stories such as those found in Matthew 1 and 2 encouraged a renewal in my own understanding of mission and ecclesiology. Not only have I been aware of the disconnect between the shape of my own ministry and the shape of Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, but I've been equally aware that many Australians have grown disillusioned with Christianity as they've come to understand it. According to an Australian Bureau of Statistics media release, since 1966, those identifying as Christian in Australia have fallen from 88% of the population to 51%, while those identifying as having no religion have grown to 30% of the population, with an even larger percentage, 39% of young adults aged 18 to 34, identifying as such. Likewise, in the United Kingdom and the USA, the decline of all major traditional denominations have been well documented. Weekly attendance at church in the US is 40%, though it is possible that it may be as low as 15 to 20%, while in the UK only 8% of the population attend church weekly. Further to this, George Barna writes regarding Christians in the US that half of all adults contend that a growing number of people I know are tired of the usual type of church experience. And 2 out of 3 adults say they are completely open to carrying out and pursuing their faith and in an environment or structure that differs from that of a typical church. Whether as an urban missionary working amongst an inner-city gay community or as a homeowner living in a rural Australian town, I'm aware of the ever-increasing gulf growing between well-meaning Christian leaders, their parishioners, and the many other people living around them. The statistics simply highlight this. The question, of course, is what to do, if anything, in response. Do we simply continue on in a business-as-usual fashion, trusting that what we are doing is indeed biblically faithful and theologically sound? Or do we need to reassess what it means to be the church in the particular situation in which we now find ourselves? Do we look back to the church of an age gone by, even the church described in the book of Acts, and seek to rediscover its forms and power? Or does the message of the incarnate Son of God as passed to us in the Gospels have anything that potentially opens to us a rediscovery of Jesus himself, and therefore a renewed vision of how faithfulness to him might look in the day and age which we now find ourselves as God's people? As someone having also been exposed to the church in many different states and situations in India, some of which is experiencing persecution and some which is experiencing no persecution. For both similar and differing reasons to the church in the West, there is also a need to reconsider ecclesiology in these contexts. In places where persecution is high, it's often unwise for buildings to be built as they can quickly attract the ire of locals and officials. Likewise, a much greater consideration needs to be taken concerning practices of church that have more basis in Western culture and Western church tradition than in anything found in Scripture. Accusations that Christianity is a Western religion are made with very good reasons. Likewise, questions need to be asked concerning styles of leadership which are a hybrid of Western traditions of hierarchical church leadership structures and local patriarchal and religious and cultural understandings of male leadership that ensure the voices of women, youth, and people from lower caste or poor socioeconomic backgrounds find little to no place in the life of the average church. As I've listened to many young people in India, like in Western nations, many are leaving churches because of the inability of leaders to consider the voices and needs of the youth. Even in states where there is no persecution and the church is in the majority, increasingly there is a disconnect growing between the young, the disenfranchised, the vulnerable, and those struggling with issues of life such as relationship breakdowns, addictions to drugs and alcohol, sexual addictions, mental illness, unemployment, homelessness, hopelessness, etc., etc. Whilst the pastor or designated church leaders are often well provided for, not always of course, and the church buildings are often maintained well, the church seems to become more about an institution providing regular events that congregants can passively participate in, rather than being a family, empowering, sharing of resources, etc., as we would read in, say, the book of Acts. Instead of the church being a people in which each member is considered an integral part of a body, where in response to God's love for us, love for each other is integral, the members are seen simply as passive participants whose main obligation is to attend events organised by the ordained or designated leaders, and then also to contribute financially to ensure that the leaders are provided for, so that the leaders can use their gifts to do what they do best and ensure that the show can go on. In this thesis and these talks, recognizing an inexorable decline not only in church attendance by people in many Western nations, formerly identified as Christian, along with the concomitant expression of disdain to Christianity as a religion, church as an institution, and even faith in God, as well as a growing disillusion by many non-Western nations of the younger generation, I'm suggesting that a fresh reading of Matthew's infancy narratives may well point to an incarnational approach to ecclesiology that will not only encourage deeper faithfulness to Christ and his people by believers, but will facilitate better engagement with the world and the culture in which the church finds itself.